We're inside of round number 1, brought to you by VigilanteMMA.com. And let's get to headlines, Dave.
All right, Jim. Like you said, we're fresh off of the TUF finale, and MMA Junkies reporting that contestant from TUF 16, Sam Alvey, has been given an immediate title shot. No, not in the UFC, but in MFC. At MFC 36, he's going to fight the middleweight champion Elvis Mutapik in what will be the co-main event and be live on Access TV. Sam Alvey, he was fighting at 170 just to be on the show. That's not his natural weight class. So going back to 185, I expect to see a completely different Sam Alvey. And I was reading that 4 of his last wins all came via knockout. So obviously at 185, he's a much bigger power puncher. Should be definitely a good show. That makes 2 title fights on MFC 36, so got to check that show out.
The other title fight, of course, at MFC 36 will be Makai Moromo against Graham Spencer. Now you add in Sam Alvey against Elvis Mutashis. A little interesting that the MFC, who is not really known to sign guys just because they fought in the UFC or just because they were on the Ultimate Fighter, when you compare him to, say, Bellator, who has signed many guys who have been cut from the UFC and Strikeforce roster. So is it a little surprising to you, Dave, to see Sam Alvey get an immediate title shot in the MFC, considering Mr. Pavlich's precedence of not really signing a lot of ex-UFC guys?
Yeah, it's a little weird, but I mean, technically, he's not a quote-unquote UFC fighter until he, really fights on the finale. It could have, and it also could have a little something to do. Sam Alvey does have a victory over Carl Amasu in his Bellator debut, and if he is 4-1 in professional competition. So, yeah, maybe it doesn't make sense because he's coming from a UFC type show, but he has the credentials to make this fight competitive for the middleweight belt.
I'm not saying that he won't have a chance of beating Mutashis for this title. I just think that considering that he was on the Ultimate Fighter show, he hasn't fought with your promotion before, you don't really kind of know what you're getting in Sam Alvey, and to all of a sudden kind of thrust him into competition against one of your champions, I think is a little much. Now, if it just simply said MFC signs Alvey to fight on the undercard, sure, no problem. Sign Sam Alvey. Great move. But to all of a sudden put him in for the title shot, I don't know if that's simply trying to grab some ratings and trying to grab some recognition off the name Sam Alvey while it's hot right now, being a former contestant of the Ultimate Fighter, or maybe MFC really doesn't have anybody else for Elvis to take on.
Yeah, I think that might be a little bit closer to accurate. That there may be game middleweights in the MFC, but maybe not game enough that can garner a couple extra views just based on their name.
In other news, George St. Pierre will face Nick Diaz for his next fight to defend his welterweight crown, passing up a potential super fight with Anderson Silva, at least for the time being, and a potential match with, in a lot of people's minds, including my own, the true number 1 contender in the welterweight division in Johnny Hendricks. And besides St. Pierre and Diaz, which is now scheduled for UFC 158 in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, 2 other huge matchups in the welterweight division were also announced, as a rematch between Rory McDonald and Carlos Condit will happen on that card. And also, speaking of Johnny Hendricks, he'll get a chance to fight, but it will be against another top welterweight not named George St. Pierre in the juggernaut, Jake Ellenberger. Dave, first of all, your thoughts on St. Pierre Diaz for UFC 158.
I don't like it. I don't like it from a principle point of view. I think there's other title fights that could happen, that should happen, mainly the Hendricks one. I just don't get it. What has Nick Diaz done since he's been in the UFC? And I'm not a big Diaz fan, so if you are, I apologize to any of our listeners. But he comes over from Strikeforce. He beats a BJ Penn that is not the same BJ Penn. He skips out on press conferences, doesn't do what he's supposed to do for the promotion, loses out on the title shot. Then he gets beat by Carlos Condit. And then now, after a suspension for illegal substances in his body, he comes back and he gets title shot. To me, it doesn't make any sense. I think it's a matter of the pay-per-view numbers maybe a little bit lower, and maybe this will help kind of spike the pay-per-views at the beginning of 2013. I don't know. I'm way more for the Hendricks GSP. It doesn't make any sense to me. It just really doesn't.
Here's a quote from Dana White according to an article on SheerDog.com. George St. Pierre asked to fight Nick Diaz because he knows they have unfinished business, and Nick agrees, quote-unquote, from Dana White. I'm all for Dana White trying to appease his fighters, but at the same time, GSP needs to fight Johnny Hendricks. I think Nick Diaz can beat GSP, but I think Johnny Hendricks has a better chance of beating GSP. And I think that is a very intriguing matchup. Will Nick Diaz sell more pay-per-views fighting George St. Pierre than Johnny Hendricks would? Possibly, potentially. I don't know. I think a lot of people, after his last fight against Martin Kampmann, know who Johnny Hendricks is now. Johnny Hendricks is not an unknown guy that has been fighting on undercards for the past 10 fights in the UFC. Johnny Hendricks is a top 10 welterweight, arguably the number 2 welterweight in the world, and should be fighting for the title. He deserves to be fighting for the title. And realistically, he shouldn't have to fight Jake Ellenberger. But he is going to fight Jake Ellenberger to prove that he should get a title shot. And Jake Ellenberger is a very dangerous guy. Jake Ellenberger, if he beats Johnny Hendricks, he could get a title shot off the fight. That's how big of an opponent Jake Ellenberger is.
If you look at the announced card, like you had mentioned, 6 of the top 10 welterweights in the world are on this card. And I was reading an article, I don't remember where I read it, but they were saying that the way it's set up this way, kind of as a safety net, like the last fight, that if Nick Diaz does something stupid, Johnny Hendricks can slide right into that fight. Johnny Hendricks should be on weight. He should be, in the midst of a training camp, to where if Diaz were to fall out for whatever the case may be, Hendricks is right there. So with that being the case, I would expect that Johnny Hendricks is going to be phenomenal against Ellenberger, because he's going to be at peak performance just in case that opportunity does arise.
Under normal circumstances, I would be totally stoked to see Hendricks against Ellenberger, but it shouldn't be at the cost of Johnny Hendricks not getting a title shot. And Nick Diaz against GSP, a match I definitely want to see, just not right now and not at UFC 158. Before we finish talking about this fight, Dave, we got to talk about Carlos Condit and Rory McDonald. Obviously, these two fought a couple years ago. Rory McDonald was actually getting the better of Carlos Condit until Carlos Condit had a great third round and was able to knock out Rory McDonald to win with mere seconds left on the clock. A rematch definitely deserved, and with Rory, even though it was a washed-up BJ Penn, a great victory nonetheless for him. And Carlos Condit coming off a loss for the title, taking on a guy that is also very tough, but a guy he has beat before.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see this fight, and I'm actually trying to locate their first fight. It's a little bit difficult sometimes to find some of the older ones, but I don't remember 115, so I'm definitely going to go back and watch it. But I think this is kind of like the who's next, obviously. I think with a win that Carlos Condit needs to be, he'll be right up there, that he'll get the next shot. And I think the same would hold true for Rory McDonald. I guess, it's tricky. I guess saying that after Hendricks, so this is next in line after Johnny Hendricks. But yeah, I don't see this fight not being exciting in the least bit. Rory really impressed me against BJ. Like you said, obviously it's not the BJ we all remember, but Rory looked pretty good against BJ Penn. All Carlos Condit ever does is deliver, so Definitely expect fireworks in this one.
All right, Dave, and how could we not end a headlines round without talking about Michael Bisping? He always seems to crop up, and we always seem to talk about him. Well, this time it's not because of something he said. It's because of something the UFC said. And when I say the UFC, I usually am talking about Dana White, as Dana White confirmed on Saturday following the TUF 16 finale that Michael Bisping would probably get the next crack at Anderson Silva should he beat Vitor Belfort at UFC on FX7. Michael Bisping's been close to a title shot before, hasn't quite got it, and with the words probably there, that doesn't mean that it's a guarantee. So even with the victory, Bisping will probably have to fight one more time. But I'm more interested to see that if he loses and, say, Vitor Belfort wins, would Vitor Belfort probably get the next shot at Anderson Silva, or is this just exclusive to Mr. Bisping?
That is an excellent point. Does Vitor Belfort deserve a title shot if he beats Michael Bisping? I have one of those bubbles over my head right now, Jim. I'm thinking. That's a very good point. Like you said, Michael Bisping's always been real close to getting a title shot. A victory over Vitor Belfort is a great victory at 185. I'm with you. I still think he may be one real good win away from a title shot. And if Anderson's not going to fight for the foreseeable future, what's the point of getting a title shot? It's kind of like having the first pick in the 2016 NFL draft. Like, doesn't really do you any good for the next 4 years. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see what would happen with a Vitor Belfort victory.
I think if Vitor wins, he has a better chance of getting a title shot than Michael Bisping, because Vitor Belfort did the UFC a solid and took on John Jones when nobody else wanted to take on John Jones at UFC 152. So if Vitor goes out there, wins decisively, gets a finish, or looks really good in the process of getting a decision victory over Michael Bisping, that's a pretty strong case for him getting a rematch against Anderson Silva. Now, the same could be said for Michael Bisping. If he goes out there and he finishes Vitor Belfort or wins decisively or looks really good in a victory over Vitor, you also got to factor that in for him potentially getting a title shot. And I know there are other factors, with the whole Strikeforce thing, and if Luke Rockhold somehow plays into this picture as well. And then, of course, there's Chris Weidman coming back from injury. Tim Boesch is taking on Costa Filippo. There's some other things surrounding it, but realistically, this matchup, as of right now, is probably the closest we'll see to maybe crowning a number one contender in the near future.